Start on the front lines of the Donetsk Republic, where Russian troops have almost completely surrounded the key city of Bakhmut, also known as Artyomovsk, while the entrenched Ukrainian garrison has reportedly been partially cut off and is having trouble pulling its troops out of the combat zone. Now, here's some of the latest drone footage from the battlefield, and it shows Ukrainian armoured vehicles pinned down and taking losses from Russian artillery. According to some reports, many of Kiev's most experienced soldiers have been killed in action during the months-long battle for Artyomovsk. However, Ukraine's American allies are now trying to downplay the significance of the Russian advance.
The fall of Bakhmut won't necessarily mean that the Russians have changed the tide of this fight. I think it's more of a symbolic value than it is a strategic and operational.
Let's now discuss these developments with our correspondent, Don Corter, joining me here in the studio, as well as get some opinion from our experts, who include Michael Malouf, former Pentagon senior security policy analyst, Sonja van den Ende, a Dutch journalist who's been covering the conflict in Ukraine, and Andre Thomas Hausen, who's a German attorney and professor of law. Thank you very much for joining me, everyone. Now, Don, I'm going to start off with you first, because you're in the studio with me. Now, this battle for Artyomovsk or Bakhmut has been raging on for around 7 months now, with both sides suffering reportedly heavy losses for it. Why do you think the Pentagon's now trying to downplay the significance of the Russian gains in this city?
Well, of course, the Pentagon now says it's not strategic, but it doesn't really make much sense for both sides to be putting so much effort, so much manpower into either holding or taking a city that was never of any real strategic importance. I mean, in the recent weeks, the Wagner private military company has done just that. They've essentially almost nearly encircled the Ukrainian troops that are still within the city, who have found themselves in a bloodbath just to maintain the defense of it. They're on direct orders from Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who said these troops need to hold their ground and they need to fight down to the last man. But we have heard reports, actually, of dissent within Ukrainian ranks. Apparently, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces is saying that Kiev should, at this point, just cut its losses and withdraw from the city. Now, if we go by what the mainstream media says, it might seem that these Ukrainian-held cities of strategic importance all of a sudden stop being strategic once they're just about to switch hands. This is what we saw the mainstream media say about Soledar when it was just on the brink of being liberated by the Russian forces in the Donetsk People's Republic, and now that's what we're seeing them say about Artyomovsk.
Russian forces try to take the strategic town of Bakhmut.
The city itself is not that strategically important.
Well, John, earlier we were in the strategic town of Bakhmut.
It is not strategically important.
It could lead to the fall of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk as well, the two most important cities in the Donbass.
There is little strategic value. It's not a military hub. It's not a communications hub.
Well, Michael, I'm going to start off with you now, if you don't mind, bring you into the discussion. What is your take on how important this battle is for this city, for both sides? Is it a strategic city? Is it symbolic? And what do you make of Washington's apparent U-turn?
Well, number one, thanks for having me. It can be significant, strategically significant, given its access to the rest of Donbass. Number two, you got to keep in mind, Lloyd Austin oversaw the withdrawal of U.S. troops out of Iraq back in 2011, and what crept in? ISIS. So I don't really care that much for his strategic analysis. And number three, it would take a lot of Ukraine troops out of the fight, and I think that this is what they want to do. Now, the other concern is is the fact that the Russian side probably doesn't have much ammunition, and I understand that the Ukrainians are also running low. So the fact that that there's this kind of focus on Bakhmut and the surrounding area does signify its significance, at least to the Russians and also to the Ukrainians. So I would really question Lloyd Austin's analysis.
Mm-hmm. Well, Michael Malouf, I also wanted to ask you what your take is about this reported dissent within the Ukrainian military ranks. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces is saying that, after all, the Ukrainian military should cut its losses and leave, while Zelensky really wants these Ukrainian troops to fight down to the last man.
Well, maybe they have some kind of a strategic withdrawal issue that they want to pursue another area, possibly, or are they psychologically trying to play on the minds of the Russians and also try to bolster the Ukrainians? However, given the Ukrainian losses, I don't think it's that insignificant, and just to poo-poo it, I think would be a demoralizing factor for the Ukrainians at this point if they were to just to get up and leave. And you look at the territory that's there, that's significant territory if the Russians take it back over. So I think that this, and given the fact that you take a lot of forces out of the fight, that to me is very, very important.
Now, Don, we've seen some images of Bakhmut or Artyomovsk, and it's been absolutely devastated. Now, the Ukrainian side, they say that around 4,000 civilians are still there, which is significantly less than the roughly 70,000 or more people that were there before the start of the war. What can you tell us about the situation currently inside the city?
Well, that's exactly right. By all accounts, it's pretty clear that the majority of the civilian population has already been evacuated, but several thousand civilians have still remained. And you gotta ask yourself, why would they stay in a completely demolished city when they know that there's going to be serious military operations in the area? And according to what we've seen, actually both in even the Western media and the accounts of Ukrainian soldiers, what we've seen is that a lot of people have stayed behind because they've awaited the arrival of Russian troops.
In the case of Bakhmut and in general, the Donbass people confidently say or are thinking that they will wait for Russia to come because they are of a pro-Russian position.
Literally yesterday, we saw through a drone 2 local women with bags in a residential area approach the Russian soldier, and they went with him towards Russian-controlled territories. Despite some people saying otherwise, many prefer to seek safety with the Russians. Those who have stayed in Bakhmut are waiting for assistance to go to Russian-controlled territory. The locals here have waited and waited for Russians and refused to leave through Ukrainian corridors.
Well, Sonia, I'm going to bring you in now, if you don't mind. You've obviously covered this war in the region quite extensively. What's your take on why people have stayed in Bakhmut and indeed other cities across the embattled Donetsk Republic?
Well, what it said before there, it's very important for them because the people are waiting for the Russians to come in. Maybe there are some people also who could not go out because lack of money or whatever. They didn't know where to go to. But I think the majority of the people who stayed there are waiting the Russians to liberate the city. And this we saw before in Volnovakha and other cities that were liberated before by the Russians. So you have this minority who will stay on. That's I think the whole point.
Well, Don, going back to you again now, obviously there were some big revelations today from Russia's FSB who claimed that it thwarted a Ukrainian attack on a Russian businessman, journalist, Konstantin Malafeyev. Can you bring us some more details on that story, please?
Right. Well, according to Russia's Federal Security Services, it was the Russian Volunteer Corps that was behind this assassination attempt on this journalist. This is a Ukrainian military detachment made up of Russian neo-Nazis, ultra-nationalists who were ideologically motivated to support the Ukrainian military in this conflict. This is the same organization that carried out an attack on the Russian border region of Bryansk, a terrorist attack. They opened fire on civilians and killed and injured a number of people. Unfortunately, this isn't the first time that we've seen, going back to this assassination attempt on the journalist, it's not the first time we've seen the Ukrainian forces try to assassinate journalists that have nothing to do with military activities. Last year, Daria Dugina was also killed by the Ukrainian security services. And Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, says that we're seeing a trend develop here.
The silence of Western regimes that are usually hyperactive concerning any case of journalist discrimination after the attempted assassination of Tsarga channel's head Konstantin Malafeyev would mean their silent consent to such crimes. This would also indicate ideological coaching coming from extremist actions of Kiev's bandits.
Well, Andre Thomas Hauser, I'm going to thank you for your patience. Last but not least, but I'd like to tap your expertise in terms of law. And what is your take on the legal status of such cases with these Ukrainian attacks inside Russian territory? Do you think they should be condemned more widely by the West?
Well, the law that should govern warfare is actually called humanitarian law. And it's been disrespected for about 30 years now in all the conflicts that we've seen. So some of my colleagues argue that state practice has just invalidated them. What remains, of course, is the essential attributes of a state. You have to have a central control over a definitive territory and a definitive population. And this is why it is so important for Russia also to make sure that it is able to protect and care for the population that have joined Russia through the independent republics, which are now part of Russia. This is really why these battles are so bitter and so procrastinated and so slow. It cannot go on forever like this. Unfortunately, we do not see a willingness on the side of the countries that want to integrate Ukraine into their sphere of influence. No reduction in sight of further weapons supplies, and no rational approach to this. The battle cry is whatever it takes, and whatever it takes means by any means whatsoever, including illegal, including assassinations, including the killings of prisoners of war, the ill treatment of prisoners of war, including staging atrocities where obviously none have taken place. The entire propaganda machine is continuing, so I'm pessimistic. I don't foresee less cruelty and less bloodshed.
Well, what would you say is the end game for the West that, as you say, is basically closing its eyes to these horrific acts?
Strangely, it reminds me of the rhetoric, of the propaganda of another very famous loser, that was Adolf Hitler at the end of the war, when Stalingrad fell with about 700,000 lost Germans. He simply had his propaganda minister declare that it was a big loss for the Soviet Union because they had spent so much ammunition to secure this battle. So these propaganda slogans become cruel and ridiculous, and unfortunately we have people at the helm of it that have completely forgotten that the United Nations Charter has forbidden any war. And no force should ever be used without the consent of the United Nations Security Council. And that includes economic war, economic sanctions. And this was so decided for the United Nations Charter at the same time when the Charter also said certain nations should have an absolute veto right, because nothing should ever be done against the will of those veto members, those veto nations. And the reason behind it was that those were the countries that had nuclear weapons. This was done to prevent a nuclear fallout. And there's a very wise saying that goes that a nuclear power can never lose a war. So we are tethering with, the West is playing with very, very dangerous things, and it undermines the international order, the international rules-based order, because the international rules are no use of force unless authorized by the UN Security Council.
Well, I'd like to stay on this subject of the West right now, and I'd like to direct one question to you, Sonia. Obviously, we've seen NATO countries basically giving a blank check for weapons deliveries to Ukraine in this conflict. Do you think that those actions that NATO is taking makes the military alliance a party to the conflict?
Well, I think so. Recently, I think when you look at the total, it's about $60 billion what they have given now in military aid. That's how they call it. And of course, they keep on saying, yes, we are not a partner in the conflict. We are not a direct conflict with Russia. But I think, in my opinion, if you give all these weapons to Ukraine, you are a part of the conflict, or you are part of the war. And I think this war mode is going on for a long time already, because last year in 2022, in March, when the special military operation started, straight away after 2 or 3 weeks, people witnessed it. All trains are going to Poland already. It said it was just, for military rehearsal there or something like that. But actually, they are planning this war. This is how I call it. It's a war. They are planning it already. Actually, since 2014, as we know, there were the Minsk agreement, which failed, of course. We know all about that, about Merkel, about Hollande, Macron. But actually what they said is that they were militarizing Ukraine since that time already. So I think they are part of a war they are waging on Russia, and they use the proxies in Ukraine, the mercenaries, the Ukrainian army. So it makes them complicit, it makes them at war. This is what I think, what we are seeing right now.
Well, in connection to this question, I just wanted to bring up something that the Russian Foreign Ministry recently put out, that these Western-supplied weapons are actually being used physically to kill people in the Donetsk People's Republic, which is recognized by Russia to be Russian territory. Do you have any comment in regard to this statement?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was many times in Donetsk city. And the last time I was there, you could see already the HIMARS working there, killing people on the market, residential buildings. And after, of course, 25th of September, it became Russian territory through the referendum. It was democratically. And they are killing Russians now. So yes, they, the West, are killing Russians with American or even with European weapons. So yes, he's right in that they are complicit, and yeah, they are killing Russians. And I think another big thing is, especially Germany, they have lost the Second World War, but they killed around 26 million Russians. So now they are doing it again. And I think Bundeskanzler Scholz should be very ashamed of himself, and actually the whole government, or maybe the whole people, the German people, they should be ashamed. They are again waging a war on Russia, and it's very terrible.
Right. Well, I guess, one of the gray areas here with these weapons being used to kill people in the Donetsk People's Republic that the West would claim is obviously they don't recognize this as part of Russia. But I'd like to direct a similar question to you, Mr. Malouf, because we've heard that these weapons supplied by NATO have actually been used to kill people now in Bryansk, in a Russian region that's recognized by the entire world as being Russian. What do you have to say about that?
Well, this is the problem with giving advanced weapons, isn't it? Inevitably, Ukraine is going to want to take this fight to Moscow, and they've said so. And that's what I'm concerned about, and that's why you want to keep jets out of their hands. Otherwise, you're going to have an unlimited war have on your hands, and it's just going to spread to other regions. We are already seeing that just as the United States and NATO is providing weapons to Ukraine, now we have Iran and possibly China. I'm not saying they've done anything yet, but there's talk of China possibly bringing in weapons. So you're seeing a war by proxy. And this is what of course, the UN doesn't cover this. A war by proxy doesn't cover terrorism either. But we're seeing this evolve into a kind of warfare that we have not seen before, and it's only going to spread. And now this could even spread to other regions for other battles, and have a cascading effect in which Israel could take the opportunity to attack Iran using the U.S. Assistance. So this thing could just get totally out of hand very, very rapidly. And I think that we're going to see this. We're in a very, very tense area right now. And I think that we talk nonchalantly about nuclear weapons use. Man, that scares me to death. To think that we use that as part of the discussion now. Well, what's wrong with people?
Andre, I'd like to bring you back in and thank you again for your patience. Now, just going back to the original question about Bakhmut, obviously this has been a bloody siege and an attritional war for 7 months now. Do you expect we'll see similar battles for further cities in the Donbass like this?
Definitely. As the military situation of the Ukraine is getting worse, most of the Western weapon supplies are ineffective. Most of the HIMARS systems are destroyed. The first Leopards that have arrived are stuck in the mud. And we know from Afghanistan and Iraq that they're no super tank at all. It is clear that militarily the Ukraine cannot sustain this conflict. And Biden knows it. He's the first one to know it. Sergeant Schultz is a bit slower in understanding it. So they will concentrate on offensives against the territories that have joined Russia. That is for sure. And unfortunately, when your conventional means of warfare are exhausted, you will resort to partisan warfare, to guerrilla warfare, just like Yugoslavia did in its resistance against the Nazi forces. And this could carry on for quite some time unless we find a way back to understanding and dialogue. In the 90s, this was the enormous achievement of Willy Brandt and the Ostpolitik. Suddenly, Russia was able to integrate with Europe, and Europe was able to embrace Russia. And that, of course, panicked America, because the EU, together with Russia, would be the strongest economic power on this planet, and that had to be stopped, that had to be hindered. So the old red danger fears were reignited. Let us not forget that following on the Nazi plan of Plan Ost, to turn Russia into a huge farm, following on that, in 1960, we had detailed operational plans by NATO to destroy Russia with 3,500 nuclear bombs. There were detailed plans. The aircraft you need to launch these bombs, and there were detailed calculations to decimate the Russian population to about 45 million people. It is not as if the world had always been living at peace and now suddenly a disaster has happened. This conflict has been simmering for at least 80 years, and it will take a lot of statesmanship, a lot of courage of individuals, of great leaders like Willy Brandt or like Charles de Gaulle or like Adenauer to understand that in fact all people on this planet are equal and nobody is born evil. And Russians are certainly not the incarnation of evil. So we will have to start reapproaching each other. And for that, some initiatives will have to happen. Let us hope that both parties in this conflict, NATO and Russia, will get tired. Will see that the economic cost of this is enormous. Most of Europe is facing a recession. Certainly, Germany is facing a recession, and England already has supply problems. People in the shops can only buy very limited amount of vegetables, for instance. We will have to hope that the next months, before the end of the year, some people will wake up and say, let us talk.
Indeed. Let's hope that apologies for interrupting. Let's hope that cooler heads prevail. I'm afraid we are running out of time. But Michael, I saw you wanted to say something. I'll just bring you in for a final word quickly.
Yes, I'm really concerned that the UN has not taken initiative. It hasn't shown a strong leadership. And I think that this might be due to the fact that the United States still tries to rule things and lead in a way that and in its world order scheme that it's trying to perpetuate here with its leadership, which is very, very destructive as we see. The problem is that we enter into these agreements for indivisibility over the years. There were 6 of them that were violated tremendously by NATO expansion, and we don't live up to our own agreements. So the question then is, what good is this world? Are these world orders if people are not going to abide by them. And I'm very concerned that today we don't have that kind of leadership to enforce this and to push this. Otherwise, we're going to have this kind of open-ended warfare again, and it's going to spread from region to region. And I see no end to this, potentially.
Well, it's a rather grim note to end on, Michael, but thank you very much. I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. That's RT's Don Coulter joining me in the studio. Michael Malouf, former Pentagon senior security policy analyst. Sonia van der Ende, a Dutch journalist who's been covering the Ukraine conflict extensively. And last but not least, Andre Thomas Hausen, a German attorney and law professor. Thank you all very much for your time today and for your thoughts. It's been a pleasure speaking to you all.